Be Gaming.
I was watching back my review of the original Dynasty Warriors, and I noticed that I mentioned something. I said that I had a loyalty to the Dynasty Warriors, FIFA and Grand Theft Auto franchises, and while that is definitely true, I could not fathom the fact that I missed a series out. A series that I have been a die-hard fan of since 2001, and that series is Metal Gear Solid. When I say die-hard fan, I mean that I'm a big follower of the main installments of Metal Gear Solid, besides Portable Ops and Peace Walker. This includes Metal Gear Solid, Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots, and Metal Gear Solid 5 both Ground Zeroes and The Phantom Pain. Every other installment I either never got a chance to play due to not having the correct system, or I read their respective plots to maintain an understanding of the story itself. This is where YouTube comes in very, very handy for situations like this. The story of Metal Gear Solid is infamous of being one of the most convoluted in gaming history. This can be seen as either a strength or a detriment to the series, depending on who you ask. But one thing is for certain. Hideo Kojima, the originator of the series, is one of the most creative minds in the gaming industry to date. I like to refer to him as the mad scientist of gaming developers. His attention to detail, his vision, his ability to tell a story, all contributes to how epic the Metal Gear franchise is. The first time I even discovered Metal Gear Solid was when I first got my original PlayStation on the Christmas of 1998. Where I got a demo disc bundled with the system, and that disc had a number of different demos you could play and videos to watch, one of them being the trailer for Metal Gear Solid. When I first watched it, I didn't really understand what it was I was watching. To be honest, I didn't really like it that much. I was still coming fresh off of my Mega Drive at this point, so I was still too used to the bright, colourful, somewhat cheerful games that I was playing at the time, and I didn't care for anything as serious looking as this. The only thing that intrigued me about this game was when I saw a video of Solid Snake and another character with him firing assault rifles back to back, and the only thing I imagined was, is this a two-player game? I loved multiplayer games back in the day. I loved playing with other people, so that would be the only thing that would have made me even slightly interested. I did not give it that much thought afterwards, and I thought that I would never bother looking at it again. In fact, the first time I even got interested in the series was when my cousin and I rented Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty on the PS2. He wanted to get it, I wasn't really that interested at the time. But when I then got to see the game in action, the stealth elements, creeping up on enemies, hiding behind cover, taking enemies out quietly, that whole tanker sequence was amazing to me. This was my first entry point into the series as a whole. And I did eventually buy Metal Gear Solid 2 from Toys R Us, and I absolutely loved it. But then one day I went to a friend's house, well after the time the PS2 was already out, and I was talking to him about Metal Gear Solid 2 and how I never even played the original game. So he said, why don't we put it on and I'll show it to you. So he fired up the original Metal Gear Solid, and I originally thought we were just going to mess around and take turns. But what was originally meant to be just a half hour of playing one game for a bit turned into us going through the entire game from start to finish. At least he played it, I didn't even want to play it. I was much more enamoured from just watching it. I enjoyed the cutscenes, I enjoyed the codec calls fleshing out all of the characters. I loved the breaking of the fourth wall. I loved everything about this. I regretted not experiencing it before Metal Gear Solid 2. But I was happy that I still got to experience it and actually like it. It wouldn't be until 2011, nearly 10 years later, where I finally did buy the original game. I moved from Ireland to Scotland for a few months, and I didn't bring any of my video game consoles with me, so I decided to buy a PSP while I was there, and I went onto the PlayStation Store and I downloaded Metal Gear Solid in the PlayStation Classic section, and I played through the entire game in one sitting. And then when the credits rolled, I did it again. I started the game a second time and I did it in one sitting. 15 hours in 2 playthroughs. I beat Metal Gear Solid in 2 back-to-back sessions in one day. On a PSP no less. Quite possibly the worst way to play it. But I loved it. I've went on long enough about my introduction to the series. But hey, guess what? It's 2018. That means it's been exactly 20 years since the original Metal Gear Solid was released, and what better way to celebrate it here on GB Gaming than with a review of that game. So today, on this episode of GB Reviews, I'm going to take a look at the game that put Hideo Kojima on the map, at least in the West. This is Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation. Please note that if you have never played the Metal Gear franchise, I may possibly reveal plot spoilers, so consider this your spoiler warning. While Metal Gear Solid is probably the one that most players would have played first, it's not the first in the series. Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake were released in 1987 and 1990 respectively on the MSX2 computer in Japan. In both games you play as Solid Snake, a rookie soldier sent in to destroy the titular weapon, Metal Gear. The original Metal Gear was also ported to the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was ported in Japan and Europe by Konami, and was ported over to North America by Ultra Games, a subsidiary to Konami, and was not directed by Hideo Kojima. This version was originally met with a positive reception when it arrived overseas, but over time it has been regarded to be almost completely inferior to the original version, with many typos and translation errors, as well as a few changes, such as Metal Gear not being featured in the actual game, despite being prominently shown on the cover and in the original version. There was also an unofficial sequel entitled Snake's Revenge, which was exclusive to the NES. Snake's Revenge is often compared to the true sequel Metal Gear 2, which was released in the same year, and as a result, it's disregarded by a lot of self-proclaimed true fans of the series. Metal Gear Solid was originally going to be called Metal Gear 3, and was originally going to be released on the Panasonic 3DO. Shortly after the PlayStation was released, Hideo Kojima decided to switch development over to that system, and he changed the name to Metal Gear Solid. According to an interview with Gamers Today shortly after the release of the game, Kojima explained why he called it Metal Gear Solid and not Metal Gear 3. He said, and I quote, "The word solid in Metal Gear Solid has 3 meanings. First of all, Solid Snake is a character name. Then, Solid also suggests 3 dimensions, like a 3D game. The third meaning deals with Square, you know, the company that does Final Fantasy. A square is a 2-dimension thing, and I guess the president of Konami wanted this game to surpass Square. They wanted to make it a cube, you know, like Solid 3D. He later admitted this as being a jab at the developer company, Square, the people that made Final Fantasy. So, 8 years after Metal Gear 2 and a near release of Metal Gear 3 on the 3DO, we are finally given Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation. Once again, you play as Solid Snake, who is working for the US military under the command of Roy Campbell, and sent to infiltrate an island called Shadow Moses to stop rogue members of Foxhound, which is the unit that Snake worked for in the prior installments. His mission is to rescue certain hostages and prevent these terrorists from launching a nuclear strike using the titular Metal Gear. Metal Gear Solid, like almost all games in the series, is an action game viewed in a top-down perspective, with a heavy emphasis on stealth, and is pretty much a necessary way to play the game. but you are not entirely limited. You could go in all guns blazing if you wanted, but it is not recommended, especially at the beginning of the game where your inventory is very small and very limited. The gameplay and style of the game is almost the same as it was in the original two games, apart from the transition to 3D and the inclusion of cinematic cutscenes and voice acting that was very ahead of its time back then.
What?
A weapon with the ability to launch a nuclear attack from any place on the face of the Earth. A nuclear-equipped walking battle tank.
And speaking of voice actors...
Kept you waiting, huh?
Solid Snake is voiced by David Hayter, who would go on to be the main voice for Snake for every subsequent Metal Gear Solid game until Metal Gear Solid 5, in which the voice was changed to Kiefer Sutherland, who I personally believe was a fine replacement for the character he was supposed to play. You begin the game in a storage basement of some kind, with an elevator that leads up to the heliport outside of the facility on Shadow Moses Island. Throughout this portion of the game, you are given not so subtle tutorials on the basics of how to play, and when I say not so subtle, I really mean it, as the characters who instruct you literally tell you to press buttons on your gamepad.
When you want to use the codec, push the select button. When we need to contact you, the codec will beep. When you hear that noise, press the select button. The codec's receiver directly stimulates the small bones of your ear. No one but you will be able to hear it.
Got it. Okay, I'm ready to go.
While all of this is going on, Hideo Kojima shows his cinematic inspirations as you can see the opening credits as you play the beginning of the game, which I thought was absolutely incredible at the time. And after learning a few basics and taking out a couple of guards, you will have to enter that elevator when it descends, and this is where the character of Solid Snake is revealed and the game title appears on the screen. After a brief piece of exposition and explanation of your equipment and what they do, you can now take full control.
Affected by the weather, but if you're discovered by an enemy, you won't be able to use it.
Yes, it gets jammed easily, I'm afraid.
Yes, it's...
One thing I loved about Metal Gear Solid is, despite its linearity, you are almost given complete freedom on how you get to your destination. As I mentioned earlier, you can go in completely quiet without getting spotted. Or you can go in like Rambo and take everybody out. Metal Gear Solid will reward the player based on how the game is played by the end of it, which allows for plenty of replayability. As you progress further, you will be able to unlock doors with keycards, find secret weapons and items, one of which includes a Nikita missile launcher, which is basically a rocket launcher that fires a remote controlled missile. And there are plenty of enemies in this game to try and avoid. Each enemy has its own patrol pattern. And what I found particularly cool early on was that if a patrolling guard happened to walk near any footprints you leave behind, he will get distracted and follow them, potentially leading him to your location.
Huh? Whose footprints are these? Huh? What was that noise?
You can neutralise guards by sneaking up from behind them and breaking their neck, or by punching and kicking them to the point of unconsciousness. If a guard sees you, he will be alerted, which is accompanied by the famous shriek effect that is in every single game in the series. Should this happen, you have the option to try and evade them by hiding. One of the most iconic, if not the most iconic methods of hiding in this game is by equipping a cardboard box and crouching inside it. The cardboard box has other uses as well. You can crawl into the back of any one of the select cargo trucks in the area and they will transport you to another destination, depending on the type of box you use. Think of it as a handy fast travel system before it became commonplace in video games nowadays. You can see the enemy status by looking at the top right hand corner of the screen, where if you are compromised, the status will appear red, which is known as alert mode. If the enemies cannot see or find you in the window of time, the status changes to yellow, which is now known as evasion mode. This means that the enemies are actively looking for you.
I heard
Once it reaches its end, they stop looking for you and will return to their regular patrol. As you continue through the game, you will be interrupted every now and then by your peers using what is known as the codec. I briefly mentioned this earlier, but what the codec is it is a small radio that Snake will use to contact other characters in the game, and is also the primary function used to save your progress.
This is Snake. Colonel, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
My frequency is 140.96. It's a dedicated frequency for saving data.
While the codec was prominently featured in Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2, Metal Gear Solid would mark the very first time that full voice acting would be used during these conversations between characters. This would be a staple for future games in the series. Most of the game's plot points and exposition happens within the codec, as well as the cinematic cutscenes, which I will get to in a moment. At certain points during the game, you will come across a boss fight. Most of the bosses in Metal Gear Solid comprise of members of Foxhound that I briefly mentioned earlier in the review. This is your reminder that there are spoilers in this review, so do take note. The members of Foxhound are Vulcan Raven, Revolver Ocelot, Psycho Mantis, Sniper Wolf, Decoy Octopus, and Liquid Snake. Each boss has their own unique strength, weakness, and outrageous personality, and I personally believe them to be one of the best set of bosses in any game I've played in my life. And I've played an absolute ton of different story-driven games with thousands of boss fights across every one of them.
The Ravens and I were testing.
And Metal Gear Solid has one of the best boss encounters to date. I'm talking about Psycho Mantis.
There's no need for words, Snake. I'm Psycho Mantis. That's right. This is no trick.
This encounter remains possibly the most innovative boss fights in the history of the franchise. It's funny. Prior to finalising this review, I had already written a script describing what Psycho Mantis is and what he does, but I decided to hit the delete button and simply say if you haven't played Metal Gear Solid, then it's best you go into this boss fight yourself and experience it firsthand. But I will say this, it is one of, if not the most well-known boss encounters in video game history, and one that really revolutionised the way a game can screw with the player at any given moment. Metal Gear Solid is absolutely filled with these little gems, and I will not go into further detail. I think I've exposed enough, and as I said, if you haven't played it, I'll leave it for you to discover yourself. You will also come into contact with many other characters which are all brilliantly written, especially Otacon, who you will meet fairly early in the game. I will never forget seeing his first encounter with Snake. It's a scene that has been lampooned and parodied so many times. My most memorable parody was from Egoraptor's Metal Gear Awesome, which completely rips this game apart in the nicest possible way.
Oh my god, I'm so scared!
Oh shit, dog, this is disgusting! Oh my god, it's disgusting hell! Hey guys, what's going on? Oh god, Jesus Christ! Ah!
Hey man, you called? Oh god.
I really do miss the Awesome series by Egoraptor. Going briefly back to the story of Metal Gear Solid, it goes beyond a simple rescue mission. There are so many plot points, twists, and emotional segments that really give off the impression that you're watching a Hollywood film. I know that sounds a bit exaggerant, but back in 1998 there wasn't really anything like this. The way the game tells its story is something that was never really seen in a video game up until this point, and I suppose this shows Hideo Kojima's love for the art of filmmaking, as he really puts emphasis on this aspect, something games never really did prior.
You'll just slow me down. You don't have enough battle experience.
I won't slow you down, I promise.
And what if you do?
Then you can shoot me.
I don't like to waste bullets.
Got it.
Metal Gear Solid has an outstanding soundtrack, one of the best of its time, and it was all composed by musicians in-house at Konami. It wouldn't be until Metal Gear Solid 2 where the music was handed over to Harry Gregson Williams, who turned it up to 11 and remained the primary composer for each main instalment, going up as far as the most recent entry, Metal Gear Solid 5. I'm not taking away from the original game's score, I just think the music was perfected by Gregson Williams going forward. I've always had an affection for video game compositions, especially games that are scored with an orchestra. Video game music and video game compositions need more recognition and need to be presented to a mainstream audience. And Metal Gear Solid is 100% up there as one of the best in the history of video games. I already said that my first purchase of this game was digitally via the PlayStation Store for the purpose of playing it on the PSP. I never got to buy a physical copy, well, at least until now. I finally bought my first physical copy of Metal Gear Solid, but since I'm awkward and couldn't just sit with a typical PAL copy, which would have been easier to get, I decided to import not one, but two separate Japanese copies of Metal Gear Solid. This version, Metal Gear Solid Integral, allows you to choose between the Japanese and the English voice acting, plus the box art is just gorgeous. Metal Gear Solid also got the remake treatment in the form of Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes, which was released a few years later exclusively on the Nintendo GameCube, and it was given a few updates and gameplay changes, including better visuals, different voice actors, and the same first-person aiming mode that was introduced in Metal Gear Solid 2. It's a common argument amongst fans of the series as to which is the better version, and since I've only dabbled in this version for the first 10 minutes, I have no opinion on it. It's a shame it was never released to any other platform since. I would have loved to have seen this make its way to the PS4 alongside Metal Gear Solid 4, or at least on the Nintendo Switch, since Nintendo may still have the license for it. It's a shame we may never get to see it make an appearance on modern systems. But going back to my topic on box art, I have to give a shout out to probably one of the best illustrators I've ever seen in regards to video game art in general, Yoji Shinkawa. This guy has worked on all manner of designs and artwork across almost every single game in the Metal Gear franchise. He is highly affiliated with Hideo Kojima and is still working with him to this day, designing artwork for Kojima's latest game currently in development, Death Stranding. He has that very distinct style that I just can't put my finger on. All I know is that once you see something that he drew, you know it's him that drew it. His artwork is one of my favourites. And this brings me to the final portion of the video. I can safely say that Metal Gear Solid is one of the finest examples, at least in this generation of video games, of how you can make a video game and still provide top-notch cinema quality stories and voice acting. Granted, it does have its campiness here and there, but that's the charm of Metal Gear as a series, I think. It hammers that fourth wall like it's nothing, and it talks to the player in ways no other games did before. When you play Metal Gear Solid, you aren't just playing a video game. The video game is playing you. And that's what makes Metal Gear Solid quite possibly one of my favourite video games on the original PlayStation. And that just about does it for this episode of GB Reviews. Thanks once again for watching. This has been Gamerboy talking to you on GB Gaming, where video games come first. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like. If you didn't enjoy it, then give it a dislike, maybe give some feedback. And if you want to see more, you can subscribe if you wish, and if you want to be notified after subscribing, hit the little bell icon. But you don't have to do any of that, there is no pressure. I do these videos purely out of my own enjoyment. So thanks again, and I'll see you on the next video. Have a good one.
TB Gaming.